So welcome everybody to our today's virtual event that we are organizing jointly with the German Ministry of Economics and Climate Policy. I'm very glad. My name is Nicola Brandt and I head the OECD Berlin Centre, and we have been tasked by the ministry to organize a joint series of events that serve to collect the views from civil society in order to feed into the discussions of the trade track of the German G7 presidency. And we're getting together today in truly dramatic times when not only global trade, but also peace and the international rules-based order are under pressure, but the German G7 presidency has decided to hold up the flag for multilateralism and international rules-based order. So I'm very glad that we have a very distinguished panel today to talk about what the G7 can do to give a positive impulse for WTO reform. And I welcome Mr. Dominik Schnichels, who's the Director General of the Trade Directorate in the Economics Ministry, and who's going to introduce the strategy that the G7 presidency follows in this respect. And we will then have a discussion with a group of distinguished trade experts. Simon Evenet, who is Professor of International Trade and Economic Development at the University of St. Gallen, is with us today. Welcome. We have Reinhard Bütikofer, who's a member of the European Parliament with a lot of experience in trade policy. Welcome, very happy that you're here. Claudia Schmucker from the German Council on Foreign Relations, who heads the geoeconomics program at that institution. Welcome to you too. And Luisa Santos from Business Europe. And I just realized that I didn't follow the rule ladies first, but anyway, without further ado, Mr. Schnichels, the word is yours, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Yeah, good afternoon or good morning. I think it's still morning. Good morning. It is a very sunny day here in Berlin, so it would have been, of course, much nicer to be in the same room with you. But I think we have all learned to work in this way in the last 2 years. And it's very great to see you. And it's also great to see so many participants. I see 115. I think that is probably double of what we had expected. So this must be your popularity, Reinhard, why people are here. And it's great to see you, Luisa. I think we met, 2 or 3 months ago in my previous function in Brussels. Well, first of all, really a big thank you to the OECD Berlin Centre, and particularly to you, Nicola, for moderating our discussion today. The event focuses on the G7 track, and one of the key topics for our presidency is WTO reform. So thank you very much to the panelists for joining. For us, this is really a very important event, because I think next week we will have the meeting of the G7, and we really are very interested to hear what you, the panelists, and you, the participants, have to say. What are the topics that we should really discuss? What is for you priority? Before I really start, I would like to say that the German government, and I think that applies also to all the governments that are represented in G7, profoundly condemn Russia's unprovoked war against Ukraine. And it's a blatant violation of the public international law and the peace and security process and fundamental principles of international law. And this was, by the way, as we, I think, all know, explicitly confirmed by the UN Assembly, which voted with a vast majority for condemnation of this act. Obviously, I think this situation also has very important implications for our work. for WTO reform. What is still possible in such a situation? I think that is one of the key questions that I would be very interested to hear from the audience and from the panelists. I think it is times like these which remind you how important multilateral rules are. This is WTO rules. This is also the Charter of the Fundamental Rights. This is the Charter of the United Nations. This is the foundations for peace, stability, and prosperity. But it also shows how vulnerable the multilateral process is. And I think that's I think the main topic I think for discussion. Our priorities for G7 are WTO reform, sustainable and resilient supply chains, and a level playing field issues. I think the topic today that we are going to discuss is essentially about the WTO reform. I think there is no doubt that WTO reform is essential. We see this sort of the effects of pandemic. We see the new trends of e-commerce. We see certain market distorting practices that have grown over the last years. So it's very important that we actually try to address all these issues. And we were looking also at the global rule book. We were looking at the dispute settlement, which is currently not functioning. So there are a lot of things that really would need our attention. And that is really coming back to the first question that I've raised. What is possible right now in the situation in which we are? And I think, therefore, I mean, when preparing, I had 3 questions that I asked myself, and I would be interested to get your feedback. First question is sort of what do you see is the future for the multilateral process, such as WTO? Or second question, should we rather focus on plurilateral approaches or bilateral approaches? And 3, what are the topics that we should focus on now? I hope I have not now stolen your job, but this was the questions, Nicola, that I think I would find particularly relevant ahead of the meeting that we have next week with the G7 members. And that's all I wanted to say. So back to you, Nicola, and I'm very much looking forward to the
debate. Yes. No, you have not stolen my job. You've made it a lot easier. Thank you very much, Dominik, for asking. I mean, the first thing to build a strategy in a difficult situation is, of course, to ask the right questions. And yeah, but perhaps I want to start with you, Claudia. It's you know, we had a discussion recently on WTO and what does it mean in the current situation, and perhaps you can give us a bit your feeling or your insights. Does it make still? I mean, WTO obviously was under pressure even before this war started. But does it make sense? Is it the right approach to discuss WTO reform now? Is it still relevant? And what would a world without a WTO look like?
Thank you, Nicola, for the questions. I'm very happy to start with the topic of WTO reform. As Professor Schnichels mentioned, the Ukraine is rightly the dominant topic, the war in the Ukraine and the Russian aggression. And I think it will overshadow a lot of the agenda of the G7. But one thing that will remain relevant in my view is WTO reform. I think the WTO is one of the organizations that provided growth and jobs for decades, that has lifted billions of people out of poverty. And without the WTO, or without the rules-based trading system, the shocks for the global economy that radiate from the Russian aggression would be even worse. And I think this makes it very worthwhile to fight for WTO reform. That said, I think it's a very, very difficult topic. And not only between Western countries, United States and China or European Union. I think the fault lines on a lot of topics of WTO reform run through the G7. And as you all know, there are 3 pillars to the WTO: the dispute settlement, the trade liberalization and rules function, and the monitoring function. And all of these 3 functions are not working properly. And I think what Professor Schnichels said, we need to figure out what is possible in the short term, because all these 3 pillars need to be fixed. But in my view, that's a lot of it is for the medium and long term. And the question is, what should be done during, what can be done during the German G7 presidency? I'm happy to talk about that further. I don't know if that answered your question so far.
Sure, no. Thank you, Claudia. And I think I want to continue with Professor Evenet, Simon, on this question that Dominik asked. So, is it the right moment to go on with multilateral systems like the WTO? Should we think at this moment, at least in a first instance? So, Claudia mentioned different timeframes, right? More in plurilateral terms or bilateral terms. What's your view about the role of the WTO in that respect at the moment?
So the WTO plays an important stabilizing role at times like this. We need to take as many of the tensions out of the system as we possibly can, and disciplines on countries to notify what they're doing, to be transparent, to openly communicate, all help reduce fears and uncertainty, which is of course at a peak at the moment. So that foundation will not go away, and I think we have to shore it up and take whatever steps we can. We will have to, I mean, and this is where I think the opening remarks were very helpful. We will have practical problems trying to do anything multilaterally if it involves Russia's agreement. Because if Russia, just take a very practical thing, suppose the Russian delegation puts a paper before a committee, it has to be discussed. And if people won't sit in the same room as the Russian delegates, which is exactly what's happening at the moment here in Geneva, then the process is stalled. So inevitably, so long as we have this standoff, there is going to be some initiatives will migrate to more smaller groupings. You can call that plurilaterals or not. But even if that happens, I think for those of us with a view to the medium longer term, we must keep the multilateral machinery going. We mustn't give up on it, and we must be thinking about initiatives over the medium term which can strengthen the system. And so, in that sense, I would urge us. It is very important that the current events are responded to very vigorously and very effectively. But we must not forget the medium and longer term goals and the underpinning that the multilateral trading system provides to our living standards.
Thank you very much. Luisa Santos, you're representing the business sector, and I would be very curious to learn your view. Where do you see in these difficult times also for business, obviously, where do you see the governance, the systems that can help you restore a little bit of order and get by as well as possible in this difficult situation?
Thanks, Nicola, and good morning to everyone. Well, it is a very difficult environment we are living at the moment, quite challenging for business. Of course, we are fully backing all the measures that the European Union, but also the US and the UK have taken. And it's good that we had this coordinated approach so far. This is very important. But I do come back. So on one end, we should build on this coordination that we had in this very dramatic situation to try to give a new impetus to the G7 also on the trade front. But we do know, and I believe Claudia already mentioned that even among G7, we don't agree exactly on what we want from the WTO. So will this crisis situation will give a new impetus for the G7 to work together on speeding up the reform of the WTO? So that would be, for me, the big question, and I hope we can answer it in a positive way. I hope that the US in particular has a clear line on what you want from the WTO, or it's simply takes the line that, well, the WTO is not addressing the big problem that we have in the room, and that's China. And therefore, we decide to go a different track. From our perspective as a business, we need still the WTO, and this is very important. I mean, most of the trade we have in Europe with the world, with our two major trading partners, but also other partners, so the US, China, many countries in South America, is done under WTO rules. So they are important as a stabilizing element. On the other hand, it's very clear that these rules are outdated, and we cannot continue in this situation forever. So I think from our side, we are very much considering that that the next ministerial is definitely going to be fundamental to define what will be the next steps. We need to see something coming out, even if it is a roadmap with clear timelines on how we start the reform and what are the objectives, how we get there. And the dispute settlement is critical, because even if we know we have the rules and they bring stability, we know that we have a problem in implementing them. So this is critical if you really want to move forward with the reform. So I think the next ministerial, also from the business side, will be fundamental to determine how we take our stance in regards to the future of the WTO.
Thank you very much, Louise. And one thing I should add for the audience before I continue with my questions to the panel is, you've heard that the Ministry of Economics is in listening mode today. So Dominik Schnichels is taking notes. So don't be shy to ask your questions here in the chat, for example, because we will take them up. Reinhard Bütikofer, we just heard that for business in Europe, it's very important to have a clear way forward for WTO reform, that business is counting on this, and that they want to have solutions for dispute settlement, the appellate body, etc. And you have a long-standing experience with this and the difficulty also to reform. So how do you see that in the current situation? Are your hopes on the G7 also to move closer together in this difficult situation? Do you see opportunities to seize now to make progress with some of these things?
Thank you for including me in the conversation. I, of course, not only understand the wish that Luisa expressed to find a clear way forward, I also share that ambition, but I'm afraid that this doesn't exist. The way forward that we can find at best will probably be a somewhat convoluted, muddy way forward. And that's still better than getting bogged down and just letting tensions and antagonisms grow by the day. I think that in order to reform WTO, or to get a realistic notion of what the reform of a possible reform of WTO could amount to, we have to shed the dream of one universal trading organization being the exclusive source of legitimacy in that realm. In our day and age, when geopolitical developments, geopolitical ambitions and tensions are overshadowing geoeconomic relations to such an increasing degree, I think this is just unattainable. I agree completely with what's been said by Professor Evernet, that we should hold on to as much of the multilateral framework to rein in a hopefully positive way the conflicts, but when the question is, should we choose a multilateral approach or plurilateral or even bilateral, my answer would be all of the above. And indeed, I also believe that we cannot make the WTO move forward. We cannot be successful in reforming the WTO unless we also use the other tools. For instance, with regard to giving teeth to the rules of the WTO on industrial subsidies. If we want to have any shot at moving anything effectively, I think that the trilateral cooperation that we've had between the US and the EU and Japan is a very important lever. So I believe that also with regard to the appellate body, that will only be solved if the EU and the US can come to terms. If we find a bilateral agreement between those two actors, that would open the road towards a reform of the appellate body. And I believe that this could really amount to an important focus, because whether we indeed give the rules that we try to implement some teeth is important to decide whether those rules make any sense at all. In addition to that, I would nominate a second priority. Reforming the appellate body would be my first priority. My second priority would be focusing on new goals for trade policy that offer the chance of providing a new shared focus. And in that regard, I believe that Catherine Tai's phrase of greening trade could provide such an angle. How can we use international trade rules, and how can we all come together to use international trade rules to, for instance, do away with environmentally detrimental subsidies? That could be a focus where there might be more consensus than on some of the long-standing controversies.
Thank you very much. Interesting points for the G7 to pick up. There are a few things that came up now from the audience that I want to throw into the discussion. And one question from the VDA, German Automobile Association, Luisa, I think is for you, or perhaps you can add something to that. And they're asking, so they say we are very supportive of WTO, but what can business associations do to support it more? Is there something from Brussels that you could, some thoughts you could bring in there?
Well, I think what we have been doing is being present and keeping the flame of the multilateral system, and still showing that we support it, we want it, and we need it. And it is important. I mean, I said, and I repeat, most of our trade is still done under WTO rules. So this is how we can do. We can, of course, because we have a large business community, and if we manage to agree with our business partners in many countries, apart from G7, that of course could help move the process forward. But it is a fact that what we see more, and this is something I have to be very clear, is that we have business more and more aligning with governments, and this is making the task also difficult to find a business consensus that goes beyond, the normal G7. So this is a challenge we have as business, but what we can do is come with concrete proposals, what we want to see from the WTO, and we have come. As I mentioned, a big priority for us is definitely the dispute settlement, but of course we are clearly interested in new disciplines on subsidies, on the greening of trade. Of course, every aspect related to sustainability is very important, because we need to also convince our trading partners that if we don't see an evolution at multilateral level, the risk we have is we're going to have an increase of unilateral actions. Two examples. The EU is proposing a carbon border adjustment measure. Why? Because we feel others are not doing enough to curb emissions. We are coming up with a proposal for an instrument on foreign subsidies. Why? Because we don't see progress in this area at the WTO. So I think this should be a way to try to convince others that if we don't take a multilateral approach, if we don't talk about this in a more multilateral or plurilateral setting, what we're going to have is countries taking the lead and regions taking the lead. And this will have eventually a negative impact also on trade and the supply chains and the way we are organized also as business.
Thank you. And Claudia raised her hand. She wanted to throw in a thought. So Claudia.
Yes, I would really like to pick up on what the other speakers said and mention and talk about possible reform efforts. I think, as I said before, we have several pillars of the WTO that are no longer working, and we need to see where we can have progress, because as Luisa said, we need to show something that the WTO is working. And I believe that nothing can be done in the short term on the dispute settlement system. USTR Thai was in Berlin, and she basically said it's a whole package. We cannot restore the appellate body to what was before. And the United States is not offering what they would like to change. We had the list of grievances from the previous administration, where the EU detailed how to respond to that. But what we see right now is from the United States, no interest in a concrete reform of the appellate body. In my view, we need to talk about taking economic remedy cases out of the dispute settlement system, about talking about new coverage. Just to return to the old system is not possible at the moment. I think it's very urgent. It's one of the main problems that we have, but I do not see any solution in the short term. From the way the United States is acting right now. I think that's a medium to long-term issue. So the question remains, what can we do in the short term? Also during the German G7 presidency. And here we were talking about the WTO lacking a common vision. I think Luisa said the Doha round. Countries do not agree anymore where the WTO should head. And Reinhard Bütikofer talked about greening of trade. I think if we connect WTO and Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, that could be something where WTO members can agree. So what does that mean for the short term? I think where progress is possible at the German G7 presidency is the interconnection between trade and climate change. And there are many issues that we can tackle. A work program for the phasing out of fossil subsidies, to look at the new declarations on plastics pollution, on structured discussions on sustainability and trade. We can look at trade and circular economy. We can look at renegotiating the environmental goods agreement. I think there are some ways where the G7 as a like-minded group can move forward on trade and climate. And I think the German government puts a huge focus also on the climate club, which is a good decision. And I think this is something where we can possibly show something in the short term, whereas in my view, things like the appellate body or the dispute settlement system are medium to long-term solutions only, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. I really want to ask Simon Evanet about these new ways to make WTO more relevant. But first, I have an intervention by Reinhard Bütikofer, who raised his hand and probably wants to say something about the appellate body.
Yes, indeed. I'm afraid with the approach that I heard from Claudia Schmucker, the reform of the appellate body is not going to be a medium or long-term issue either, because if we measure a possible outcome by the yardstick of restoring the appellate body to its previous state, I think we're misguided. The appellate body overexpanded the authority it had been given by the member states. And that's the basic grievance that different American administrations have raised over the years. That started with Obama. And I strongly believe we would have to be willing to make concessions also with regard to our own orthodoxy that was so overly happy that once, with a huge exception to the normal approach that the US are taking to international conflict resolution. President Clinton had given in against some opposition back in the States, and empowered the appellate body with a great level of authority. But if we are not willing to sort of take those grievances seriously, there's no way forward. And I have seen in the European, from DG Trade, a growing acknowledgement that we have also contributed to the breakdown by being completely inflexible. And I would rather have an appellate body that takes account of some of the American concerns than not having one. Fiat justitia pereat mundus is not a good principle.
Thank you. So maybe, I don't know, listening to you, I'm thinking perhaps having some principles worked out by the G7, what a new appellate body should and shouldn't be doing. Maybe could be a good contribution. Is that, would you agree to that, Reinhard Bütikofer? Could that be a contribution by the G7?
Yeah, and I think Dombrovskis knows a thing or two about that.
Very good. Simon Evans, I want to come, well, if you want to say something to the appellate, about the appellate body, you're very welcome. But I wanted to come back to some of the work you've been doing, also advocating for saying that what the WTO can do to show its relevance. And I think some of it was to show that the organization can contribute to things like international climate policy, promoting digitalization, digital trade, and giving some rules to it. But also using it more to create transparency, data, to really understand what's going on. That was obviously would have been very useful in the COVID crisis, but perhaps also in the current crisis where trade is disturbed quite a bit. Are these still things you think the WTO should be doing, could be doing, to show that even in a crisis like this, it's relevant and the place to go to settle international trade issues?
Yes, I mean, I strongly believe that the WTO has a role to play, not just during the good times, but also during bad times. And I think, as this discussion with our colleagues is showing, we actually need to talk about this institution quite differently. Framing it in terms of efficiency, growth, things like this no longer resonates. I think if we are going to find a common purpose, it has to be around what people see as 21st century priorities. Some of our colleagues have mentioned the climate change agenda, the green agenda, which I think is an excellent sort of unifying theme. The rise of digital technologies is not going away. So we have to ask to what extent can we avoid fragmentation in that space as well. And so I think one of the important lessons is getting beyond the sort of rather stale Uruguay round rhetoric, which I think has got us nowhere. A second point I would make, again, looking backwards in order to go forwards, I think when people talk about a multilateral solution to a problem, they have to remember that even in the Uruguay round, we had enormous differentiation across different types of countries. In the Doha round, we had 11 different categories of WTO members, and this was still called a multilateral initiative. So quite frankly, most of the previous multilateral initiatives were actually plurilaterals, but just mislabeled. So if that was always the norm, then going forward in groups of the coalitions of the willing, hopefully larger coalitions of the willing, isn't such a problem. So I do think we've got hung up on the language. And I think we've got very hung up on the language with respect to dispute settlement as well. In many ways, for me, a really effective trading system is one where countries don't have to go to dispute settlement because because no one has broken the rules and there's no temptation to break the rules. And so, fixing the dispute settlement system is fixing the backstop. One ought to think further about why is it in the interests of countries to support these rules in the first place? And that, I think, leads you to I think you put the question to Claudia, a system, what does the world look like without the WTO? That's a very scary world. And so I think we really need to reorient how we talk about these issues. You asked me also about transparency, and I think this is, again, another one of these things which problems we have, legacies from the Uruguay round. Too much of how people talk about the WTO, especially if in my field in economics, is about how things get liberalized. Actually, a really important part of the WTO are the rules for good behavior and the transparency which builds confidence. And so I think one of the important roles going forward is to try and limit and head off tensions between countries by encouraging transparency, further transparency. And this is an area where the Secretariat could make enormous progress in the near term. And I actually think, to bring the subject conversation back to the events of the current time, we are quite likely to enter into, in this second and third quarter of this year, a very serious food crisis in parts of the world. And we will need an excellent monitoring system in place to ensure that countries do not unnecessarily put in place food bans and food restrictions or export restrictions on food, which are already beginning to creep up in southeastern Europe as we speak. So I think this system retains its relevance in crises and in good times. And I think we need to look at what has worked and what we can fix. And a lot of the sort of Uruguay round language and thinking, I'm afraid, probably doesn't carry over to the 21st century. So we need a new narrative too, and I think that is an area where the G7 can help. Because we need to agree on why we're doing this, okay? Why we're supporting this system.
So yeah, that's very interesting. It sounds like so perhaps also making it more concrete and what the WTO can serve for. So if you can show that it can prevent food crises from happening, of course, that would give it a lot of relevance. So that's very interesting. And I think we've received a few questions related to that also. Should it be, Simon said we need to move beyond efficiency and growth to 21st century goals like climate change. But something I would like to pick up from the discussion in the chat is Andrea Mehling and Helene Peltonik. I think they asked about things like business integrity, corruption. Isn't corruption also hindering fair and green trade? So is it something that the WTO should look into as well, business integrity? And it would be interesting to hear from you, Luisa, what you think. Is that going too far, or is it something that would precisely help to show that that the WTO can serve to ensure the kind of trade that we want in some ways?
Of course, I think the WTO, well, to start with, I think the discussions at the WTO level are going in different parallel tracks, because the members have different needs and different priorities. And I think this is very clear. We do have this rule of consensus. That is, as the EU ambassador to the WTO said this week in an event that we organized, is that consensus now has become unanimity. So actually, consensus means that the countries should work to have a common ground. But actually, this is not being used like this. This is being used to simply block any decision. And that's why we are moving to plurilaterals. Now, is this going to be the future? That's why for us it's important that we see clearly in the next ministerial if this is really going to be the future. Are we really incapable of continuing to have an effective rule of consensus, in the sense that we we continue to be able to have multilateral rules and multilateral enforcement, or we decide once and for all that this is not possible, and that we need indeed to look at plurilaterals as a way to reform, as also the way to bring new topics to the table. Because of course, we can always add, we can add corruption, we can add social. I mean, we had many of these issues already in the Singapore agenda before, but then you need to convince all the members that these are relevant for everyone. And we have already problems today in convincing that the topics that are in the agenda are relevant for everyone. We have developing countries saying we do not recognize ourselves in this agenda. We are not so concerned about competition issues or subsidies. We are more concerned about development issues. So we have this mismatch. The more issues we had, the more mismatch we're going to have. So I think we need definitely, I insist, I think this next ministerial will be important to see if this consensus rule can be turned into something that is meaningful in terms of multilateralism, or if we on once and for all say, okay, we're going to keep the minimum there multilaterally, and we try to go more to plurilaterals. My final point is that we also see, and this is something that the business community is very much looking at, we see a strong securitization of trade. What we do see is that we have more and more political decisions impacting trade. We have more and more national security concerns, and the exception of national security being used. So in the end, we have all these actions, unilateral actions on national security that are actually impacting the existing multilateral system and the multilateral rules. And we cannot forget this, because in the current context, I mean, this is very relevant. How can we ensure that whatever rules we have in the end are not simply overcome and become obsolete because national security has become the main objective and the main reason to go unilaterally and to take other type of measures. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think I want to, adding to this, I want to pick up one question from the audience directed at you, Mr. Bütikofer. Wilhelm Ruprecht is asking, what possible relation do you see between the WTO and the climate club concept of the German government? Could that be connected in this presidency or beyond?
Well, the climate club idea that the chancellor has been advocating for quite a while can cut in different ways. It can possibly be used as a tool to encourage partners to join force. It can also be used as a workaround, basically showing some reluctant partners the middle finger and saying, look, we ran out of patience working with you in the multilateral framework on these complicated issues. Now we tell you where we stand and you find your own way. I'm not sure which way this is gonna go. At the moment, I'm not sure that this climate club concept is really finding a lot of takers around the globe. And I also see a certain contradiction between the climate club concept and the European Union's work on CBAM. That's not the same approach, and we even have discussions in the European Parliament about whether we should insist on a position that my group has taken for some time now, that CBAM should be developed in a WTO compatible way. That's not necessarily the majority position in the European Parliament. So all of these concepts are basically at the same time trying to shape some hopeful new approaches and at the same time endangering the probability that we may come together as a global community.
So climate policy, or doing climate policy in general, but also in the WTO, is not easy. Claudia Schmucker, I would like to take up another idea that came up in the chat too. So the, well, let me call it increasing block building, something that you look at a lot. So the West, perhaps rule countries that think of themselves as rule abiding, looking at an international rules-based order, and perhaps other countries that have other approaches in the international trade system. Do you think that that is something that's endangering work at the WTO, or does it precisely call for more effort to find ways to negotiate there and find common solutions?
Thank you for the question. I just wanted to pick up some of the things that were said before. I think maybe on WTO reform again, we need to make sure that the WTO is delivering. The same goes for the G7. And the question, why do we need the G7, or why do we need the WTO? And as Simon said, the old Uruguay round is not enough to say we need liberalization. And what we do need is a common vision. And I come back to the Agenda 2030. And we need to make sure that the WTO, and the same holds for the G7, has answers to the challenges that we are facing. And that means it must have answers to the pandemic. What can the G7 and the WTO do to alleviate the problems of the pandemic? And therefore, I think we need the trade and health initiative that the Ottawa group is proposing, hopefully at the next MC12. We need answers also on climate change. And this is why I think the environmental goods agreement would be good. Climate Club, it must be WTO compatible. That's a must. I think the DG Trade is of the opinion that it is WTO compatible. That's disputable, but at least use the G7 to try to develop common standards on a sort of climate club and talk about what can be done. Let's talk about food crisis. You mentioned that. What is the answer of the WTO? Can't we have, like in the previous financial crisis, a moratorium on tariffs, not only regarding health products, but also food exports? So let's see that we can get answers to the challenges that all countries are facing. And in that, I must come back to the only multilateral agreement that we are negotiating still is the fisheries subsidies. And this agreement is really important to show that we can agree on a multilateral level, and it also has the sustainable development goals that I would push for a vision at its center. So I think it's essential at the MC12 that we work on that. What you mentioned with block building, this is exactly the major risk that we see at the WTO. We have discussions on, do we need a WTO of the West? Should we even trade with autocratic regimes? Should we only trade with democracies? I think this is a fundamental crisis of the WTO. If we go into block building and it's the Western countries against others, I think we will have a huge problem, and it would in the end destroy the WTO. So I think we need to find common ground, and I think what the Commission also proposes, the concept of competitive neutrality, try to enter as many values as we can into the negotiations. But I think it would be dramatic if we agree or accept the direction of this kind of block building.
Thank you, Claudia. And Dominik, I kept you in listening mode for some time now because I wanted to pick up some issues, but I'm sure since you're here to listen and learn also for your G7 presidency, perhaps you want to comment on some of the things you've heard. And I also have a very concrete question for you from the audience, because somebody said, well, ideas for reform abound here for the WTO, but what's lacking is political capital that's being put into this, and also support from the business community. So what are your ideas on that? How do you respond to it? And for your G7 work and beyond, do you think that you need the support of the business sector to make some good progress on WTO reform?
Good. Yeah, indeed. Thanks a lot, Nicola. A very rich discussion already and more to come, I see. Let me just say sort of what I've taken so far from the discussion, and it was already a lot. It was much more than I say now, but very good. And I really appreciate all the openness and I think straight talking. So first of all, I hear a lot of encouragement to not give up on WTO, to continue, to make the effort, even in the times when it is difficult, to believe in the multilateral system. It's the basis of a large part of our trade. And even if there are challenges, rules are not only there because you can take them to court, but also because people actually voluntarily follow them. And I think it was very interesting that that was the point that Simon made, that this discussion between a distinction between plurilateralism and multilateralism is maybe a false discussion, because many of the projects start as plurilateral and then turn multilateral or something like that. Even that is not true. It's something that we know, I think, also from EU legislation. We have the so-called enhanced cooperation, and that's the coalition of the willing that is sort of ready to make the next step, and always with the invitation for others to join. So I think that's I think it's a very good approach. Of course, it has to capture enough participants. Otherwise, it's not working probably. So that was the first point. Thanks a lot for the encouragement, even in times when it's difficult to go ahead. The second point that I picked up, I think rather strongly, is that there are concrete topics that need to be addressed. But even in the G7 group, we don't really have a lot of conversions, and I think the example that was given was the Appellate body. I'm not sure that the panel has a full consensus on it. I think I hear that some Claudia in particular believes that this cannot be solved immediately, whilst Reinhard said, okay, well then don't go for the optimum, go for something intermediate. I think it would be very interesting for us to get a bit more concrete what exactly would be the options, what could be done on this point, because I think it is like I think all of you have said, a sticking point, a difficult point, and I think ultimately it's one we need to solve. Otherwise, we don't get the Americans in the boat, and without the Americans, I think the glass is not even half full. Then the third point, and I like that a lot, is sort of okay, Uruguay round and liberalism, and that's all very nice, but that's basically the narrative of the last century. We need a new narrative for the 21st century, and I think you offered a lot of different topics already. I think you said link between trade and climate change. I think you mentioned e-commerce. I think you mentioned also the food crisis that is coming, because I think there are some countries, particularly in sort of the European southern neighborhood, so the Mediterranean countries, which rely up to 90% for wheat supply from Ukraine and potentially Russia. And if that is not working this year, I think we might be running into a major food crisis, which will probably on the European markets only lead to increased prices, but in I think some of the countries to very severe shortages. So I think it's interesting that sort of WTO starts thinking about sort of what their contribution could be. Then I think Louisa in particular, she mentioned sort of the growing trend in unilateral actions that countries take. And I think that's something that we see, I think, on the European side. I think the anti-subsidy instrument was mentioned, the anti-coercion instrument is there, the IPI, which is in the final stages of discussions. Reinhard probably knows much more about that than me myself. But there also CBAM was mentioned, and I mean we also know that the US is thinking about launching a 301 investigation, and I think it was in the news by now. So there's a lot of use of unilateral instruments in the world at the moment, and everybody speaks about sovereignty and autarkism, etc. So I think interesting sort of how we actually bring this together. Then there was a lot of talk on climate club and CBAM, and whether that is one, or is that not sort of something where is this actually a confrontation, or is this actually something we think together, or is this something that will probably be my personal view, is this something which is complementary? So this is I mean, when you think about minimum taxation at the EU level, we always wanted to introduce minimum taxation, and when it got concrete, suddenly the world woke up, and we now have more or less an agreement worldwide on minimum taxation. So could CBAM not be something like that as well? I mean, that sort of we think we need to, in Europe, we need to protect our industries, because otherwise we have carbon leakage and the industry moves out. But if all the others make the same effort, then it is no longer a risk, because everybody makes the effort, or at least the ones that, so we should have a CBAM then, not for the EU, but for all who have made the same effort. So I don't see it really as a contradiction, but I see it rather as a complementary and an encouragement to move forward on the international level. But I had one last thing on MC12, but I think I'll leave that for a later stage.
Yes, thank you, and it gives us good food for the continuation of the discussion. And I'm also glad you're referring to the minimum tax agreement that was found, as there are, of course, some OECD mechanisms that could perhaps help, and could perhaps also help with looking at CO2 prices worldwide. But Simon Evanet, perhaps because Dominik asked about, well, what is there concretely that could be done, perhaps even from the G7 side, to look a bit closer at the reform of this appellate body? Do you see some concrete things that you could well, give him on the way, so to speak, so that this can enrich the G7 discussions?
I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you there, because I don't think there is anything in the near term either which can be done in this regard. I think the bigger opportunity actually is to capitalize on the fact that now trade policy is being talked about in a different way. For far too long, trade policy has been talked about in, which group in society does better or worse. And in the American context, that means talking about a worker-centric trade policy, which some of us have a hard time understanding what that might mean. If there is a silver lining to the events of the last few weeks, it is now that we have the State Department actively engaging on trade policy. And for those of us who remember the historical record, that was actually a positive, because the diplomatic community over in the United States may not know the details of trade policy in the same way that some of us have to, but they were very much behind the idea that trade policy was a way of knitting together nations and uniting them. And so if this helps change the narrative away from this zero-sum distributional logic, which appears to have gripped a number of US administrations, into something which is a little bit more outward-looking and where they're open to new opportunities, then I think we might stand some chance of actually making progress in some of the areas which we've been identified. And again, maybe if that happens, then a few years down the line, we can come back to dispute settlement, which is it's a vital question. But as I think Mr. Bütikofer has said, the American position on this has been hard-baked for 10 years, if not 20, and it's going to take them a long time to get beyond that. So let's have some wins in other areas, would be my recommendation. And let's capitalize on the traditional diplomats joining the trade diplomats and seeing the relevance of trade as a support for geopolitical ambitions.
Thank you. And perhaps, again, a question to you, Luisa, that comes a lot, that would be interesting to see the business perspective. So several comments here in the chat refer to civil society and to have rules that are acceptable, etc., that will work in their building. Somehow civil society has to be involved. How do you see that from a political perspective, and how could it work at the WTO or the G7? Do you think, well, this is a civil society event, so to speak, with the ministry trying to collect views and use that as an input, but are there other ways to do this?
Well, we can build on what we have in Europe, where we had in the last years a stronger engagement from civil society in trade policy. We have, of course, regular meetings of civil society and DG Trade to, for instance, to explain where the process of negotiation of free trade agreements is. We also have built in our trade agreements. We have what is called the domestic advisory groups that basically monitor parts of the agreement. In many cases, most cases, the sustainable development chapter. But now for the EU-UK trade and cooperation agreement, for the first time, we have this group monitoring the whole of the agreement. And this group includes, of course, the main, we are built that way in terms of civil society participation. We have the business, trade unions, and other NGOs. So we do have some examples within the EU that could potentially also be used at WTO. But let's not forget that even the business community, we don't really have a normal platform of engagement with the WTO. We are now trying to build it and to have this kind of a group that exists as an interface between the business and the WTO Secretariat. We do have this public forum where everyone is open to come. And we have more and more civil society participation in this public forum. So this is important. The question is how to bring the civil society participation also into the negotiations. And this is something I think we have not yet found a solution in the WTO. Should we have a more structured discussion, more structured approach? Should we do this overall for the whole work of the WTO, or should we do this as an interface in the main negotiations that are ongoing at WTO level? But I think this is definitely one of the areas where I think we need still to work, how to bring more civil society engagement during the process also of negotiation of the different aspects that are ongoing at the WTO level. But I think we have an experience in Europe, and of course we shouldn't dictate this experience, but I think it's a good basis also for the WTO.
Reinhard Bütikofer, to this idea or this concept of engagement of civil society, also from your perspective as a European parliamentarian, probably one way it often happens is at the national level, right? There's some sort of level lobbying at the national level, and then it's somehow synthesized at the European level. And I'm sure that's even stronger at the WTO. Would there be other ways, multilateral ways to integrate views of different groups that are going to be concerned by the decisions being taken? Is that something you should think about when reforming the governance of the WTO and other institutions?
Well, I do recall that in the context of the TTIP negotiations, there used to be regular dialogues between the transatlantic negotiators on one side and transatlantic consumer representatives on the other. I attended some of them, and I would say for the better part, they were rather frustrating because it was more like going through the motions without adding enough substance to the formal exercise. But still, I would say it reflected an incipient understanding that trade policy today will never again be the kind of arcane science that used to be the privilege of some very specialized lawyers that meet in whatever kind of rooms. This has become a public topic, a topic for public controversy. TTIP played a major transformative role. And I think that's a force for the good, because it gives us a better chance of understanding how trade policy has to be intimately aligned with societal and political goals. There had been this prevailing notion that in a way trade is a world unto itself. It is governed by a prevailing economic logic that doesn't have to pay tribute to other kinds of rationale. That is obviously not anymore the case. And when Luisa talks about national security concerns overshadowing trade and investment relations, that's just one way in which this new reality that I call the predominance of geopolitics over geoeconomics makes itself understood and forces itself upon the agenda. And I think that we need to develop, in a fundamental way, an understanding that goes back to the Kantian understanding of trade as a force for global peace in his famous writing about zum ewigen Frieden, towards perennial peace, where he described trade and democracy as the two transformative motors of global brotherhood. We misunderstood that as an automaticity. Trade would in itself and of itself deliver that. That's not the case. So trade has to be made as a policy arena that understands that it has to address national security concerns. The TRIPS waiver can be framed, that we unfortunately refused, could be framed as a national security concern to defend public health in developing countries. And if we understand that we have to develop a trade policy that takes these concerns, these political concerns from consumers, from workers, from the middle class, from whatever corner seriously, then we might have found the angle from which we can oppose the withdrawal behind unilateral policies. If these political concerns are not addressed in the plurilateral and multilateral arena, they have to be addressed unilaterally.
Thank you very much. And perhaps I want to go to one thought, Claudia, that you brought up, just to think about concrete things that the WTO could do to show its relevance. And you were mentioning fossil fuel subsidies, looking at that, perhaps collecting evidence, and then having a structured negotiation, what can be done to reduce them, to promote climate policy. Is that one thing one should do when thinking about WTO reform, doing things that are very concrete, where the public and negotiation partners can see, look, we can actually achieve something, also in the spirit of Simon, what Simon said before, appellate body too complicated, but make sure it's relevant and speaks to people. What's your thought on that?
Thank you very much for the question. There's so many interesting topics coming up, and I would like to comment on all of them, but I won't. I just have a couple of points that I want to start with before I go to fossil fuels. I think one important aspect where the WTO needs to be reformed, and this is what Simon just briefly mentioned, is transparency. I think there's a huge way to increase monitoring and transparency, and this would be something where I would suggest to empower the Secretariat, which is lacking right now. And there's a hesitancy by WTO members to give more powers to the Secretariat. And I think this is something that could change. My second point is briefly to plurilaterals. I think apart from fisheries, and even that is unsure, the way forward is plurilateral. And as Simon said, in a way, this has been done for a long time. And if they're open to new members, if they are on an MFN basis, I would even consider them multilateral. So I think the way forward is through plurilateral agreements. And when we look at the 4 joint statement initiatives, I mean, we did have a success with services domestic regulation. So there was one success that we can also point to. And usually, the hesitancy towards plurilaterals is that it's the developed countries who have lost interest in the Doha round and developing concerns, so they push forward with their own ideas through plurilaterals. But when you look at the joint statements and initiatives, you have a lot of engagement also by developing countries. So I believe this will be the way forward. Just briefly on appellate body, I think what we need, and it seems so little, but I think we need an open discussion. We really do not know what the US wants. They talk about judicial overreach, which could be right. We have a very dangerous appellate body ruling on what constitutes a public body. But what do they want concretely so that we can enter into discussions? And I think the G7 is a very informal group. We say we are like-minded. Why not start an open discussion what is needed rather than talk very vaguely about we need to change everything. So talking about all these things, fossil fuel reforms, we do have from the G7 in the UK and also previously fossil fuel reforms, we have an end date for that. We agreed on that. But what we are actually lacking is a concrete work program on how to get there. And also what we talk about is inefficient fossil fuels. What does it mean? What's the definition? It gives a lot of loopholes. So I think what I said before, we need concrete ideas and concrete outcomes. Why not have a work program on how to end fossil fuel subsidies and a concrete definition? And I think that would be a huge success for the German G7 presidency.
Thank you. And with that, I think, Dominik, I want to go back to you on one idea, thought. So we heard a lot about this appellate body. It's incredibly difficult to reform. We don't know what the US wants. And then some suggestions how your presidency could be a success. But I think there's probably, so from my former incarnations when I worked on G7, I remember that it's very, no, how it's called, not press release, but it's very declaration driven. So you're working on the declaration that comes out of the end. But if these things are so delicate, is one way forward not to have more of fireside talks, informal talks, to really understand what the other parties are after, and without declaring victory, so to speak, at the end? Could that be one way you approach the issue in your presidency?
Thank you very much. Before a very good question. But before I come to that, I just wanted to say a few words about transparency, and I think because it's also sort of stakeholder engagement. And I just wanted to tell you, when I started in DG Trade some years ago now, basically everybody was saying trade is great for everybody. Liberalize everything and it's good. Everybody will have better products at a lower price, and the classic sort of liberalism thing. And I think we have lost a couple of people there, because it's not true that liberalism or free trade is everything. There will be people that will also lose their jobs because they are producing T-shirts in countries where it's no longer competitive. We will have a challenge of our environmental rules. We have a challenge on our social rules. And I think that was very much the agenda sort of 25 years ago. It was a bit too much. And I think the colleagues in DigiTrade have woken up and have understood that. And I think there's a lot of trust that has been lost, I think, from the NGO scene. And I think that's, very important to engage with business, but also with the NGO, with civil society, to regain the confidence into that trade is ultimately positive. But it also means that the trade rules will have to change in the way that you have mentioned, in terms of sustainability. We have to look at issues like health. We have to look at issues like social standards, and I think it's very important. And I think that we are on a track there. It's not an easy one, but I think we are on a very good track then. Just to come back on what is our ambition for G7, I think we wanted to do it a little bit different from the previous presidency, which was the UK, which had, I think, event after event and declaration after declaration. I think we said we want to do a little bit less, I mean, in terms of topics, but then more open discussions, and then particularly on issues such as WTO reform, which was, I think, our top priority. And that means we have more possibilities for open exchanges, what can be done, what can we agree upon, and then informally discuss it and sort of hopefully have, that's always the hope when you have such discussions, convergence in the outcomes at the end. It's not guaranteed, but I think that's the aim. So I think I'm new to the G7 process, so I can't tell you whether it's going to work, but I'm very happy that my colleagues opted for an approach that I personally find much more suitable, at least to my way of thinking and working. Is it now a good moment also to say a few words about MC12, or do you want to have some more questions from the audience?
Well, why don't you do that, and then we can take it from there. Yeah.
Good. So MC12 is now scheduled for provisionally scheduled for mid-June. I think that's very good. We're very much supportive of that. I think all the problems that Simon mentioned on participation of Russia, of course, are really tricky. I think WTO has, or the EU has decided essentially not to engage with Russia at the moment, which even means that if Russia is attending a meeting, that the EU representatives would get up and leave the room. So it's not sort of an easy start to move forward. The four big topics I think are very well known: agricultural, fishery subsidies, WTO reform, and health. With the sort of topic of TRIPS waivers, or what do we do with the patents and vaccines, where I think the EU has consistently, signaled openness to find good solutions for the countries that want to develop their own vaccination production. But the idea was that we do it on the basis of the licensing regime and up to the compulsory licensing regime. And I think the discussions with South Africa are quite. There is some hope, and I think we would be happy to support it. Whether it will ultimately fly, of course, is a difficult thing to say. obviously, so for us, these 4 topics are a package. We don't want to do a concession, or we just solve something here, and then the other stuff which is important to us, such as WTO reform, is put on the backbench and said, yeah, but now we have cashed in what we wanted, and in the rest we are not interested. So we are very much in favor of a package approach, and the deal is only done when a deal is done on everything. So that's, I think, quite an important point from our side. We will have to see. I think we go by side at the moment. We move forward as we go along, but from our side, we will do everything to support a successful MC12, and we will prepare it well in the G7, hopefully with our partners. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, I think we have a few minutes, so I want to just pick up on a few things, and then at the end, I think I will give you the word, and you can tell us what you've learned, perhaps, and taken away for the G7 process. But Simon, just to pick up on something Dominik just said about this, and you said it before, you know, it cannot be ever more liberalization, etc. Trade policy, and we have to look at 21st century goals. But of course, in trade also, there's a lot of trade-offs. So, and Claudia, she said we should have a stronger secretariat. So does that go together? So should there be more analysis by the secretariat, data collection, etc., to understand the trade-offs, and then basically take the negotiations from there? Or how do you approach this?
So let me say 2 quick things. I mean, I firmly believe that high quality information and analysis is a global public good, and it often helps lay the foundation and clear away a lot of misconceptions. And quite frankly, the Secretariat could do more of that if the members would let them. I don't see much interest from the members doing that, but that would be my point. But I'd like to go back on, you know, when we think about the G7 presidency this year, we should be open about what constitutes success. And I know there's this tendency, and we saw this last year, that you have declaration after declaration as if we're making forward progress. But given the events are moving so fast at the moment, and given you know, the uncertainties on where the American position is, actually a G7 presidency where things do not unravel further, and there's not a dispute or dissent and fragmentation would be a big success. So I'm very much of the view that the fireside chats approach might be the approach for the times that we're currently in. I would love to see you know, declarations of things going forward, but I think we have to be pragmatic here, and I think we do need to encourage our American friends to articulate after 14 months in office what exactly their vision is for the multilateral trading system.
Yeah, that's a very nice, that's a good point. And perhaps I will pick up on that and ask the others, were they in a very pragmatic way, how you would define success of this presidency in terms of trade? Perhaps Luisa, from the business perspective, if there's one thing you should wish for, what would it be?
Well, if we have a real commitment to the multilateral system, that would be positive, because again, as we are saying, we still have a lot of doubts about what the US really wants from the multilateral trading system. And I think it's important now more than ever to have this clear line from the G7 running up to the ministerial. So this will be important. We are actually on the positive side when it comes to the idea of carbon clubs. We do think, and this I have not touched before, but for us it's extremely important as European business. Many of these rules are critical for our competitiveness. I mean, the fact that we don't have disciplines on distortive subsidies, the fact that we don't have everyone with the same ambition when it comes to climate change, is negatively impacting also European competitiveness. So whatever we can do in this area, also in the G7, for us will be extremely important. And this idea of carbon clubs, of course, we need to see how they go, is something that we actually see in a positive way.
Perfect, thank you. And unfortunately, we cannot ask Reinhard Bütikofer. I had to leave a little bit early, but Claudia, perhaps you have one thought before I give the final word to Dominik.
Thank you. My first thought is mirrors Simon, unity of the G7, that we continue this unity is the major thing. The other than the Ukraine, which is the important topic right now, I think the other crisis that we are facing is climate change. And so to see whether trade can contribute to the fight against climate change and to inclusive energy transition, this nexus, this is really important. And the more concrete outcomes we have to show the public that the G7 works on this and enhances this issue, I think this is important.
So Dominik, you have clear guidance now from the civil society, but perhaps a final word on what you've taken away from today's discussion.
Thank you very much. I think I gave already sort of a couple of minutes ago sort of a summary of all the points that I found particularly helpful, noteworthy. There's only maybe one point that I would like to add because it came out in the last discussions. I think we have a major crisis at the moment, and at the same time, I think a crisis also offers opportunities. Before this crisis, the US was essentially speaking about China. I don't know whether you have read the speeches of Catherine Tai, but it's essentially about China. And I think now it is much more about, again, about values and about sort of allies. And I think there is an opportunity also in this crisis that at least the G7 are sort of uniting again more and think more about a common agenda. And I think we should try to sort of look at these opportunities very much. And I think when you look at these opportunities, I think it's clear that WTO needs a new narrative to be relevant also for the 21st century. And I think we need to find this new narrative. And I think the link, the nexus between trade and climate change is certainly one that for our ministry, the Ministry of Economics and Climate Action, as it now is called, I think would certainly have a lot of sympathy for this approach. So from our side, there will be no silos. The question, of course, is whether this is echoed by all the other countries represented. But really, I would like to say, first of all, really many thanks to you, Nicola, for excellent sharing and for bringing us together, and for all the panelists for their very good ideas and comments and suggestions. And also from the audience, there were lots of very good comments and questions that you have brought to our attention, Nicola. Many thanks.
Excellent. Yes, I enjoyed this collaboration as well. I'm looking forward to wishing you good luck for the G7 process. We will continue our joint work on other subjects, on sustainable trade and level playing field, which are also relevant for the WTO. Thank you, Claudia, Luisa, Simon, also for participating, and thank you for a very active audience bringing in their thoughts. I think that really this event gave us what we were looking for as an impetus for the G7 process. So thank you very much and have a nice, sunny, indeed, afternoon.